Hi, I'm Peter Dre Ray. Welcome. I'm wearing a zebra tie, just to show you a little bit briefly. Actually, this is a tie that I purchased, not my father's tie. I think it was the only tie I ever bought. Actually, the rest were my father's. Anyway, today's topic is John Adams, Part 4. Now, we stopped last time in 1786, and life was good for John Adams in 1786. The American Revolution had been won. And, he was the guy more than anyone who said, we should fight a war of independence. We should have this American Revolution. And we can win the war. And he was right, because we won the war. So he was vindicated. And, there was a lot of stress in the war. He felt it was a lot of stress during the war. He was thinking, what did we get into? What did we start? And then the fact that we won, made it all right. Made it seem like we'd done a very good thing. We had achieved our independence. We could decide our own fate. And Adams played a major role in that, in getting French support, French naval support at the Battle of Yorktown, and Dutch loans from the Netherlands. Okay, and now he was enjoying himself. He was working as a diplomat in Europe, different countries of Europe, and Abigail had come, and she was with him, so she was very happy. They had some family time together. Now, the one thing that was, Adams didn't know that there was trouble brewing, though, with his two sons, Charles and Thomas, who had been left behind. They'd really grown up pretty much without their father because he was gone so much. And now they were without their mother, and they were still very young. They were in their early teens, preparing for Harvard. And of course, John didn't know that he would have horrible heartbreak with both of those two boys in the future. But anyway, in 1786, he was feeling pretty good about himself, and he's feeling happy the war had been won. He didn't have to worry anymore crossing the Atlantic Ocean about becoming captured and becoming a prisoner of war. And there was one issue that we were having, which was ongoing, which was with the countries of North Africa, and they called them the Barbary States. They were capturing different ships, European ships, and demanding tribute. And this was an ongoing issue with these North African countries. And anyway, in 1786, Adams met with Abrahamman, the envoy of the Sultan of Tripoli, which now would be Libya. And part of the protocol for these Muslim countries was to, in diplomacy, was to drink a lot of coffee. The Muslims didn't believe in drinking alcohol, and so it was tough dealing with the Russians. There was so much drinking involved, and that was really, really tough. Anyway, so with this Abrahamman, John was drinking a lot of coffee and smoking a lot of tobacco on these hookahs, these pipes. And apparently he didn't get sick, and he was able to keep up, And so the secretary of Abrahamman cried out in ecstasy, "Monsieur, vous êtes un Turc," French for "Sir, you are a Turk." I guess the Turkish people, the Turkish guys had the great ability to drink a lot of coffee and smoke a lot of tobacco. That was kind of a funny story. Adams had time to travel in his time in Europe, his remaining few years in Europe, and he traveled with Thomas Jefferson. Remember, they'd become friends, and they knew each other a little bit in the Continental Congress, but then they spent a lot of time together in Europe, and they both were intellectuals. And of course, later they became political rivals. And so, since they were both historians, and they knew the history of England, which was where freedom had been achieved in the modern age first, when people had fought abusive kings and limited the power of kings. And they went to these historical places in England, including Edge Hill, where the first great battle of the English Civil War was fought, and Worcester, where Cromwell's final victory over King Charles II was achieved in 1651. Interesting aside is in the English Civil War, you had the forces of the king versus those of Cromwell, who was fighting for the people, or for Parliament, for democracy. And they called those who supported the king Cavaliers, and those who supported Cromwell the Roundheads. And then Cleveland Cavaliers actually are named after these. Comes from this Cleveland Cavaliers NBA team. Comes from the English Civil War, the Cavaliers, and of course they lost the war. So maybe we should have picked the the supporters of Cromwell. And of course, the Cleveland Roundheads wouldn't sound so great. So anyway, Cleveland Cavaliers. Now anyway, when Adams and Jefferson were in Worcester, England, this very historical place, they found that the local people were ignorant about what had happened there 130 years before. And they're just simple country people, and they didn't know the history of this place, that it was so profound. And so John Adams was very upset, and he gave an impromptu lecture to them. And he said this, quote, "And do Englishmen soon forget the ground where liberty was fought for? Tell your neighbors and your children that this is holy ground. All England should come in pilgrimage to this hill once a year." You have to wonder what these people thought about this little speech that Adams gave to them. So anyway, he was a historical man, and Americans had achieved their freedom from Great Britain, but he was also acknowledging that freedom had been fought for and won in England. And again, this is a theme why Americans fought the War of Independence, because they had a sense of, as Englishmen were a free people, and here he's based on their history, what they had done. They had fought for freedom. And so I thought this was a wonderful story that he knew his history. He's a great historian. The following year, 1787, his daughter Nabby gave birth on April 2nd to a son, William, in London. So John and Abigail became grandparents. Now that year, 1787, is when the U.S. Constitution was written in Philadelphia. Delegates came from all over, and this is when we became one country. When the national government really was formed. There was a very, very weak national government before that, the Articles of Confederation. And so now John was not there. He was in Europe, but he knew what was going on, and he supported it because he knew that we needed to create a national government. We needed to become one country. And so after the Constitution was written, he wrote this, quote, "The Constitution is the greatest single effort of national deliberation that the world has ever seen." He actually had written a book called Defense of Constitutions, which was influential at the Constitutional Convention. So he contributed from afar. Adams continued about the Constitution, quote, "It appears to be admirably calculated to cement all America in affection and interest as one great nation." And he continued, quote, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate of any other." He was saying this is a common theme that he and others had during this time, that if we're going to succeed as a country, we need to be a good people. And how can we be a good people? Through God contact, since God is a source of goodness. I think this is a very, very important point to make and to remember today if our country is to survive and prosper and continue in the year 2018. Adams wrote also in 1787, quote, "Popularity was never my mistress, nor was I ever, or shall I ever be a popular man. But one thing I know, a man must be sensible of the errors of the people, and upon his guard against them. He must run the risk of their displeasure sometimes, or he will never do them any good in the long run." See, you hear stories of politicians, they're looking at the polls, what do the people believe, and they'll end up voting on something based on popularity polls, based on what, and the thing is, public opinion is fickle. It changes. And so I think he has made a very good point here that, it's important to do what's right, what an individual believes is right, and you can listen to other people and their opinions and so forth. But you really should do what's right. And he did this because this was important to him. And as he said, he wasn't, and this hurt him politically. When in the Boston Massacre legal case, it hurt him. And then as president, he was doing things. And so I think he's right. We should do what's right rather than, because public opinion changes. Again, one of his favorite historians was Thucydides from ancient Greece, who he quoted that same year, that the source of all evils was, quote, "a thirst of power from rapacious and ambitious passions." In June of 1788, after 10 years abroad, he had come back to visit, but mostly 10 years in Europe, he returned to Massachusetts. And Massachusetts Governor John Hancock created a very big welcome for him. He was a big hero. He was the conquering hero. Very popular. People knew what he had done, all the good work that he had done for our country. So, and he'd been gone for, really kind of out of touch with America after all these years abroad. So this was nice that he got such a warm welcome, and it was appreciated by the American people for what he had done, the service that he performed in Europe for our country. He was also having financial problems because a lot of the guys, this was common. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, they were all. This is how it was back then. That we were a poor country, and the public servants could not be compensated well. Now, in 1776, the population of the United States was 2 million people. By this time, now we're getting into 1788, the population had doubled to 4 million. 100,000 Loyalists had left. They moved to Canada, Jamaica, Bahamas, and Great Britain. Philadelphia was the largest city with 40,000 people. Remember, London had like 600,000 people, and Paris was huge also. New York City only had 18,000 people. Virginia was the richest and most populous state. That's based on tobacco. And the Army really had been reduced greatly in number. There were only 700 men in the U.S. Army. Pittsburgh was the westernmost city, had 500 people, and there were 700,000 African American slaves. So the Constitution had been written in 87 and ratified in 88, so it became law. The 13 states agreed to join in this union, the United States, and then the first election was held. And in early 1789, and George Washington was elected president, and John Adams was elected vice president in early 1789. And so the inauguration took place in New York City, and John and Abigail found a nice home. They were very happy there, but the capital was only in New York City for 1 year before it moved to Philadelphia. But they were very happy there in this nice home that they found in New York City, and he started his time as vice president, serving under George Washington. And he immediately got into political trouble because they had a debate on what should be the official title of the president. And Adams was kind of a traditionalist, believed in that authority should be respected. He was not, what they used to call a Democrat, where you would really want to eliminate property or eliminate wealthy people and have everyone being equal. And so anyway, he was kind of traditional, and he came up with this title for the presidency, and it was this, quote, "His Highness, the President of the United States of America and Protector of their Liberties." And that did not become the official title. The title just became the President of the United States. And anyway, he was mocked for this idea that he had, and people started calling him His Rotundity, because he was, he's kind of squat and a little overweight, a little paunchy, and so this kind of hurt him politically. It was early on in his time as vice president. Actually, he was pretty bored. There isn't much to do as vice president, but he served faithfully. And there was a vote in Congress the following year for having a pension for Baron von Steuben, who had learned the military art, quote, in the only school in the world in which they were taught by the great king of Prussia, Frederick the Great. And actually, some years later, his son Charles ended up living with Baron von Steuben in New York City for a time before von Steuben retired to a farm in upstate New York. And Charles was very, very sad because they became good friends. The French Revolution broke out in 1789, and this was a really dramatic thing. And Americans were very polarized, in terms of were they for the revolution or against it. And only 2 times in American history have Americans been so polarized, aside from the Civil War, and that would be the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution in the 20th century. And so this is a very divisive thing. And actually, even now, if you study the French Revolution, it's very hard to come to terms with what exactly happened. And so anyway, and Adams eventually was very much against it because there was so much craziness going on over there in France when they started just killing so many people, and when they tried to eliminate Christianity. It just turned into a bloodbath, and so they just got carried away. And Adams wrote in 1790, quote, "Too many Frenchmen, after the example of too many Americans, pant for the equality of persons and property. The impracticability of this God Almighty has decreed, and the advocates for liberty who attempt it will surely suffer for it." Yeah, one of the issues in today's world is the difference between the wealth and poor. Rich and poor. This gap, which actually is growing today, and it's always been a problem because there are resentments. The suffering of the poor, and which is real, and then the resentments against the rich for everything they have, all their mansions and so forth, and so and then there are people who say everyone should be equal in property. The idea the wealth should be confiscated from the wealthy. Now the problem is if you do this, then it really undermines hard work, and because then what happens? People become demoralized. It hurts the country, and if you do that, and actually the wealthy often have to be killed to get their property. So there are a lot of talented people among the wealthy. It's easy to just, especially among the poor, to be anti-rich. Oh, look at these greedy, rich, evil. Rich people, but it really isn't true. Now I think there are good and evil among both rich and poor, and so if you try to eliminate wealth, which has happened, places like the Russian Revolution, and this was happening in France, then what happens? Usually the economy falls apart. Everyone becomes very poor as a result. If you try to destroy the wealthy people by confiscating their property, and then basically you have an elite. There is of course, the old elite was based on privilege, like being a king or a duke or nobility, but that's really passé today. Now the elite would be wealthy people from business and from industry and from banking, and then if you want to eliminate them, you still will have a new elite, but it will be based on political power. That's what's happened in these communist countries. So, and what's that? What's the basis for that? These individuals having power simply because they could get it, control the government. And whereas if you're in business, at least if you're very wealthy, like John D. Rockefeller, he was one of the very elite people, one of the richest men in the world. But he actually contributed something. He didn't just have power, political power. He made a major contribution to the world in terms of petroleum production, for kerosene and gasoline, and then all the philanthropy he did, a lot of good. So anyway, this is important. This is still an ongoing issue, and the problem, and really, what we need is you need for the wealthy people too, and there is all this philanthropy, a lot of good that's being done by rich people around the world. In 1790, George Washington almost died. Only a year into his term of office, and this was almost a disaster. Abigail Adams wrote, she was a very positive thinker, and she wrote, quote, "A merry heart doeth good like a medicine." The capital moved to Philadelphia after 1 year, so Adams served for 8 years as vice president, and so 7 of those years were spent in Philadelphia, and Abigail didn't like it. She started having health problems, and she didn't want to come to Philadelphia. She stayed in Massachusetts in their home in Quincy, and Adams was really at this time becoming more needy for her. She really had needed him earlier, when he was in Europe, but she'd become independent. Now he was really kind of dependent on her. And actually, during his vice presidency, he would spend 9 months of the year in Quincy and only 3 months in Philadelphia. And because he wanted to be with her, and he didn't like city life as well. And back then, the U.S. government, actually didn't do as much as today. It wasn't a year-round affair. Now, some of the issues they had early on in the Washington administration was this debt from the war. What would happen to that, and where would the capital be? And then this compromise was achieved between the two big players. And Washington was an old guy, and the two strong personalities in his administration were Alexander Hamilton, who had grown up in poverty in the Caribbean, and was actually very young, and had this rapid rise, and he was a very talented fellow, very energetic, and became a part of the elite bankers in New York City. And then the other one was Thomas Jefferson. These two really locked heads and banged heads and were in conflict. And so they came up with a compromise that New York City bankers would handle the debt, the national debt. And up till now, that's why New York City has the financial power in our country. And then the capital would be in Philadelphia temporarily for 10 years. It was the last 7 years of his presidency and the first 3 of John Adams. And then there will be a new capital built on the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia in the South. So the South would have political power and the North would have financial power. So that was the compromise that was achieved. Adams didn't like Alexander Hamilton, and he said this about the banking industry. Quote, he called it an infinity of successive felonious larcenies. I'd have to say I'd agree with that. It's up till now, it's still the issue of banking, and everything really comes down to human character. You can't. If people are going to be conniving and do stuff, what are you going to do? Ultimately, we have to do the right thing because we want to do the right thing. Otherwise, we're all in big trouble. You can pass all the laws you want, and people are going to find ways to break those laws. Benjamin Franklin died in 1790, so this was a big deal. Actually, 1790, and so. Adams, again, they had this conflict, they had troubled relationship. They did not get along. They were very different. And Adams kind of had, I quoted him earlier, he knew he would not be popular. But the thing is, he wanted, he was human. He wanted to be recognized for his contributions. And then he believed that history would be written, he'd be ignored, his contribution. And actually, that really happened. Adams is a forgotten guy. And so Adams wrote that he predicted that the history, he's talking about the history of the Revolution. And he said this, quote, about the American Revolution, quote, Dr. Franklin's rod smote the earth, and out sprung General Washington. Franklin then electrified him with his rod, and thenceforward these two conducted all the policy, negotiation, legislation, and war. So you see, he was trying to say that he thought Benjamin Franklin and George Washington would get all the credit. So you can see that he was very human. He wanted credit too. Benjamin Franklin had written about John Adams, and he said this, quote, he means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise man, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. So this is one of the things that was said about John Adams, is he was out of his mind. And he did get carried away. He could get kind of crazy. So anyway, revolutionaries, people who want a drastic political change, they believe that governments are the cause of social injustice. They said, if we only have a revolution, this is why you had the communist revolution in Russia and China and Cuba and the French Revolution. And then John Adams believed that social problems exist inside human beings, their envy and passion for distinction, which then created a craving for wealth, in which the stronger and richer pressed their advantage, generating greater social inequality. So this was he felt inequalities are always going to exist, just based on the way people are, and then you have these revolutionaries. Well, all they do is create a new elite, and it's not based on business success. It's based on political success, being able to acquire power. And he had this to say. Adams had this to say about the French Revolution. I know not what to make of a republic of 30 million atheists. Yeah, I have to agree with him. This, the downfall of the French Revolution is, they saw there were problems with the Catholic Church. Absolutely. Problems with priests and bishops and cardinals and popes who really weren't Christian, who abused their power, who were arrogant, who were hypocritical, and so forth. But the thing is, there have been over the centuries many good priests, good nuns, and so forth, and good people who really, and the Christian message helped them, that we should love each other. Just because there have been religious leaders who have been hypocrites, who've been wrong, who've been evil, that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist or saints haven't existed, and that spirituality and religion has helped people, because it has. This wonderful message of Christianity that we should love God, love each other, Now, it's helped so much in helping people to change for the better over the centuries, for 2,000 years. Now, in places like in France, and then in Russia and China, Cuba, they thought, oh, we're going to eliminate religion because they think, oh, all religion is evil. Well, then things really fall apart, because then we don't, because then if this is taken away, the idea that we can commune with God and seek God and pray, and this can help us, what happens? People deteriorate under the influence of the world. So this is why I think the French Revolution, they became very barbaric and cruel, and it was just like a bloodlust of the poor getting revenge against the rich. Well, what's achieved when revenge doesn't achieve anything, it just makes things worse. We have to forgive. Yes, wrongs are committed, and this is, again, one of the great messages of Jesus Christ, forgiveness. Because without forgiveness, we're going to be fighting forever, endless fighting and hatred, and terrible. So, and then again, the thing about politics is, things we need to have change, but things take time. Change needs to be evolutionary. You can't have rapid change. You can't have drastic change that's going to make a country better. Now, revolutionaries, leftists would disagree, but this is what I believe, and I think I support John Adams in his belief that, and ultimately, things will only get better government when people change for the better themselves. You can only change yourself, but if you do, you've made a major contribution to the world. In 1793, Adams wrote about the French revolutionaries. Danton, Robespierre, Marat are furies. Dragons' teeth have been sown in France and will come up as monsters. Yeah, the French Revolution turned into a disaster. It was very tragic. And Americans were divided. Yes, I know Thomas Jefferson was very much in favor of it. I was a long believer. Adams was against it. You could see, and George Washington was against it. There were political conflicts. Again, Adams and Jefferson had been friends, but they were really divided by the French Revolution, as all Americans were, as the Russian Revolution did. And Jefferson tagged Adams as mentally unsound and a monarchist, that he was mentally ill, and he believed that we should have a monarchy, we should have a king in the U.S. And these were unjust; they weren't true. But it was, they had this political conflict, and they were commonly made against Adams for the rest of his life. That he was mentally ill, and he wanted to create a monarchy in the United States. It wasn't true. Yeah, he had his problem. He had a temper. Yeah, he could get a little bit crazy. But look at all he had achieved in his life. If you're mentally ill, you can't get the things done that John Adams had achieved. He worked very, very hard. His hometown of Braintree was renamed Quincy in 1792. And he was bored during these years as vice president. There's not much to do. It's kind of a boring job. And he had this to say in 1792, quote, "Such long continued attention to debates and business is not very charming to a man accustomed to the conversation and amusements of Paris, London, and The Hague." These types of statements probably turn people off. He'd been in Europe. He'd been in the high society in Paris and in the Netherlands and in London, and so he people would resent this when he would talk about this, and he'd had these experiences, but I think there was a lot of jealousy of what he'd been through, that he'd been in Europe, and most people hadn't. Washington was reelected for a second term in 1792, and then John Adams was reelected as well. So this was his, and then by 1796. Washington said, he's going to retire, and that was going to be it. He was going home. He would only serve 2 terms. So this meant there would be a new president, and this is a big deal in our country. Washington's retirement, and we'll talk about that next time. It appears we are out of time. To quote Scarlett O'Hara from the wonderful movie Gone with the Wind, "Tomorrow is another day. Live long and prosper. May the force be with you. May the road rise to meet you. May the wind be at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face and rains fall soft upon your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. God bless you. God bless the Philippines, America, and the whole world. See you next time.